The truth is, I weaponized my own progressive politics to justify something far more selfish, and everyone who's defending me online has the story completely backwards. I didn't get betrayed by the non-monogamy I championed. I engineered this entire catastrophe because I was too chicken shit to admit I wanted out of my relationship the old-fashioned way. What nobody understands, what they can't possibly grasp from the Instagram posts painting me as some wounded polyamory pioneer, is that I'm the architect of my own humiliation. The real kicker, the detail I'll get to eventually, is that I created a fake dating profile to catfish my own boyfriend just to prove he'd be bad at ethical non-monogamy. What's at stake isn't just my 3-year relationship with Marcus, though that's already ashes. It's my entire identity as the cool, evolved girlfriend who had it all figured out. My feminist theory cohort thinks I'm living proof that patriarchal conditioning ruins progressive experiments. My Instagram followers have turned me into a hashtag. But my real fear, the one that keeps me up at night staring at the ceiling, is that I'm actually just a regular cheater who dressed up my betrayal in academic language. And the thing everyone's getting wrong, Marcus didn't abandon our agreement. I systematically sabotaged him the moment he thrived in ways I never anticipated. I'm going to tell you everything, the calculated conversations, the intellectual dishonesty, the moment I realized I'd rather burn his happiness to the ground than admit I was wrong. But first you need to understand the weapon I used against us both, the specific text message where I laid out my boundaries that were actually tripwires. By the time I'm done, you'll see this isn't a story about failed polyamory. It's about how I tried to have a safety net for my cowardice and ended up strangling us both with it. 6 months ago, I was finishing my gender studies thesis on compulsory monogamy, and Marcus was juggling his programming job and my increasingly theoretical approach to our relationship. I'd come home buzzing with ideas about deconstructing romantic possession, about how exclusivity was just capitalism applied to hearts. He'd listen while chopping vegetables, nodding in that way he had, head tilted, slight smile, which I mistook for agreement when it was really just love. I remember standing in our kitchen, watching him reduce balsamic vinegar, and thinking how perfectly he'd fit into the footnotes of my argument. The man could cook, could code, could quote Otter Lord after 2 glasses of wine. I'd built him up in my head as this perfect partner for my political project, never once considering he might have desires that didn't orbit mine. The vulnerability I'm trying to own here is that I was terrified of being ordinary. Every woman in my department was either getting married in barns or having threesomes in Berlin, and I couldn't stand the thought of Marcus and I becoming the boring couple who peaked in grad school. When Professor Chen praised my chapter on monogamy as colonial construct, I floated the idea at dinner. What if we're just performing jealousy because we've been scripted to? I said, swirling my wine like I'd seen in the movies. Marcus stopped mid-bite, his fork hovering over roasted Brussels sprouts. Are you asking to open our relationship, or are you just thinking out loud for your dissertation? He wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. He was curious, which meant he was actually listening. That's when I felt the first flicker not of freedom but of satisfaction. I'd expected hesitation, a wounded look, maybe a fight that would end with me comforting him. Instead he said, I could research some frameworks. There are ethical ways to do this. The hook sank in at that moment. At exactly 7% of this disaster I realized I wanted him to fail at this. I wanted him to try and fall apart so I could be the enlightened one holding us together. 2 nights later, I laid out my terms over Google Docs like we were negotiating a hostage situation. 3 dates maximum per outside partner. No sleepovers on weeknights. Weekly check-ins with feelings spreadsheets. I called it ethical scaffolding, but the architecture was designed to make any other relationship feel like a bureaucratic nightmare. Marcus read through it, his brow furrowing at the no overlapping social circles clause. Isn't that kind of isolating? He asked. I doubled down with the kind of academic bullshit I'd later regret it's about preventing complexity contamination. Keeping the primary dyad sacred requires strategic compartmentalization. I actually said those words out loud, and he wrote them down. The hook at 10% was me watching him type my nonsense, feeling powerful instead of nauseous. My best friend Leah called the next day while I was organizing my jealousy into a color-coded journal. Are you sure you're not just trying to have your cake and eat it too? She asked, her voice carrying that particular skepticism she reserved for my theory phases. I laughed, too loud, and told her this was about dismantling my own conditioning. It's an intellectual and emotional experiment, I said, quoting my own thesis introduction. She went quiet, then Marcus isn't a research subject, babe. That was the 13% hook. I dismissed her concern as internalized monogamy, but her doubt burrowed in deep. What I didn't tell her, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I'd already been flirting with a postdoc named David from the sociology department for 3 weeks. Nothing physical, just coffee that ran long, texts about Foucault at 2 a.m., the kind of emotional affair that feels inevitable when you're starved for intellectual mirroring. The 18% hook is this confession I suggested opening the relationship 2 days after David mentioned his own open marriage. I wanted permission to explore something that was already blooming in the hothouse of my ego. Marcus gave me that permission with the same grace he gave everything else. For the first month, Marcus didn't act on our agreement. He read books, joined online forums, created a dating profile that sat dormant while I texted David increasingly unprofessional things. I told myself this proved my theory that given freedom, people choose security. Then Marcus matched with a software developer named Priya. She was 32, built her own apps, and had been ethically non-monogamous for 5 years. He showed me their messages, asking permission to meet for coffee. I approved with a smile that felt like swallowing glass. The truth bomb detonated when he came home from that coffee date. He was glowing, telling me about Priya's work on accessibility tech, how she'd asked about his childhood in Tulsa, how they'd walked along the lake and talked for 4 hours. I thought this would feel weirder, he admitted, kicking off his shoes. But it just feels like making a friend I might kiss someday. I nodded, updating my jealousy spreadsheet, while my stomach ate itself. The 22% hook arrived that night when Marcus fell asleep, and I used his thumb to unlock his phone. I found texts from Priya, thank you for being so honest about your relationship. That's rare. I deleted the ones where Marcus wrote, I feel more myself with you than I have in years. The next morning, I told myself I was being pragmatic when I texted Priya from a burner number. He's not as available as he claims, I typed, my fingers shaking with something I refused to name. His girlfriend is having second thoughts. She replied immediately, thanks for the heads up, I'll talk to him directly. That was the 24% breadcrumb, the hint that I'd miscalculated, that my sabotage would have to escalate. By week 6, Marcus was seeing Priya once a week, and I was sleeping with David in hotel rooms we expensed as research collaboration. The compartmentalization felt professional until David started asking about my feelings. I'm not looking to replace my primary, I insisted, using the language I'd learned from podcasts. David laughed, a sad sound. You know you sound like a textbook, right? Meanwhile, Marcus invited Priya to his climbing gym, a place I'd never been because I hated the chalk dust. He came home with his hands roughened, showing me a video of Priya completing a difficult route. She's teaching me technique, he said, his pride obvious. The hook at 28% twisted deeper. Priya was better at my relationship than I was. That's when I made my worst decision yet. I created a profile under the name Morgan and matched with Marcus on a different app. I used photos from a model's Instagram, the kind of curated beauty I knew would appeal to him. I wanted to test him, to prove he'd cheat on Priya given the option. The 32% hook snapped shut when he messaged Morgan back immediately, hey, you're gorgeous. I'm seeing someone but it's open, how do you feel about ethical non-monogamy? He was doing exactly what I'd asked him to do, and I hated him for it. The 35% breadcrumb was me, drunk on David's bourbon, telling him about Marcus's hypocrisy. He's supposed to be building a primary relationship, not collecting secondaries, I slurred. David looked at me with the first real pity I'd seen. Isn't that what you're doing too? I changed the subject, but the truth was burrowing deeper. I'd never intended this to be equal. Marcus's confrontation came on a Tuesday. He found the burner phone I'd been using, the one I'd stupidly left charging in our bathroom. Why do you have a second phone? He asked, holding it like evidence. I laughed, the sound brittle, for work contacts. Boundaries, remember. But he'd already powered it on, seen the texts to Priya, the dating app notifications. You told Priya I was lying about being available. His voice cracked on the word lying, and the 42% hook tore through me. I saw my own reflection in his hurt, and it was monstrous. I went defensive immediately. I was protecting our primary dyad from destabilization. I shouted, using my thesis language like armor. You were moving too fast, prioritizing NRE over our established bond. He stared at me, the man who'd once memorized my coffee order, who'd driven 5 hours to my grandmother's funeral, who'd learned to bake sourdough because I said I missed the bread from my childhood. Lena, he said quietly, you're not my professor, you're my girlfriend. He left for Priya's apartment that night, and I told myself it was temporary. The 48% hook came when Leah finally called back. I can't do this anymore, she said. You're my friend, but you're being a fucking nightmare. Marcus called me, he told me everything. My support system, built on years of shared confidences, crumbled in the silence between her sentences. You need to figure out why you'd rather destroy him than let him be happy. She hung up, and I realized I'd lost more than Marcus. By week 8, I was spiraling. David had ended things after I showed up at his office crying, demanding he make me feel better about Marcus leaving. This was supposed to be casual, he'd said, gently removing my hands from his lapels. You're outsourcing your emotional labor onto everyone, but the person you're supposed to be honest with. The 53% hook sank deep. I'd managed to alienate both men by being exactly the person I'd pretended not to be. That's when I saw Priya's Instagram post. A photo of Marcus cooking in her kitchen, the caption grateful for partners who show up honestly. The comments were flooded with heart emojis from their polycule, people I'd never met celebrating the relationship I'd created the conditions for but never wanted to succeed. I screenshotted it and texted it to Marcus so much for our privacy agreement. He replied with the 58% question that still haunts me. Did you ever actually want this, Lena? Or did you just want permission to leave without being the bad guy? I deflected, of course. Told him he was projecting, that his attachment style was showing. But the 61% hook was already setting up the final reveal. I'd written my entire thesis chapter on our relationship before we'd even opened it, assuming I'd have a tidy case study of how compulsory monogamy crushes even the most enlightened couples. I'd never imagined the data would show me to be the controlling variable. The full confession begins now, at 67%, because you can't understand the rest without this. I never believed Marcus would find someone better at understanding him than I was. That was my unspoken hypothesis, that I was the ceiling of his relational capacity. When he messaged Morgan back with such genuine enthusiasm, I'd felt validated. See, he's just like all men. Then I'd spiral into panic because Priya wasn't a theoretical threat anymore. She was real, and she was kind, and she asked about his code projects in ways I never had because I'd always found them boring. The most damning detail, the 72% hook that turns my stomach, is that I used Morgan to test Marcus's loyalty to Priya. I sent him messages saying I'd only date him if he was truly single. He wrote back, I'm committed to my primary partner, but we practice non-hierarchical polyamory. If that's not for you, I understand. He was perfect at it. Ethical, clear, protective of both relationships. I screenshotted his response and sent it to Priya from yet another fake number. He's telling other women you're not serious. I wanted to poison them both. 77% consequence. Priya broke things off with him. She said she didn't have time for relational turbulence. Marcus came home that night looking like I'd felt for weeks, hollowed out, confused, betrayed. I was doing everything right, he said, more to himself than me. Following all the rules. I held him while he cried, feeling victorious and devastated in equal measure. I'd won the battle I'd secretly started, and lost the war I'd pretended to want peace in. The final hidden element drops at 80%. David hadn't ended things because I was too emotional. He'd ended them because I'd told him, in a moment of tipsy confidence, that I was using our relationship to test the robustness of primary partnership under duress. I'd literally academicized our affair. He'd recorded the conversation and sent it to Marcus. That's how Marcus knew I'd never been honest. The theoretical framework had been a cage I'd built for both of us, but I'd been the only one with the key. The aftermath is where I live now. At 85%, I discovered the unexpected consequence. My thesis advisor called me in after Marcus emailed her. He'd attached screenshots of my experiment and asked if this was standard research methodology. She placed me on academic probation for ethical violations. We study systems, she said, her disappointment worse than anger. We don't weaponize them against people we claim to love. My reputation in the department curdled overnight. I went from promising scholar to cautionary tale. At 89%, the moment of genuine self-awareness broke through. I wanted to be chosen. Not just loved, but selected above all others. My entire argument about outdated monogamy had been a performance of security I didn't possess. I'd confused liberation from possession with freedom from consequence. When Marcus thrived without my ownership, it revealed that my progressivism was just possessiveness in a better outfit. I'd wanted the moral high ground and the comfort of knowing he'd never leave. I'd wanted to be both the cool girl and the only girl. The current state, 92%, is this Marcus moved in with Priya last week. Not because they got back together, they didn't. But she'd offered him her spare room while he looked for his own place, and he'd accepted. They're building a genuine friendship, the kind I'd pretended to want for us both. He texted me, "I'm picking up my books this weekend. Please box up anything that reminds you of me." The cruelty is so gentle it eviscerates. I'm telling this story now because yesterday, I saw a TikTok of someone explaining how monogamy is a tool of the patriarchy, and the comments were full of people tagging me, resurrecting my old posts about being brave enough to dismantle my own conditioning. The video has 50,000 likes. My infamy lives on while my accountability rots in drafts I'll never post. What I've learned is imperfect and incomplete. I learned that you can't theorize your way out of being human, that wanting to be special to someone isn't weakness, and that Marcus was always the one brave enough to be honest, first with me, then with himself. I learned that I chose the most cowardly form of control and called it freedom. But here's the residual defensiveness: I still believe monogamy is a social construct. I still think we need new relationship models. My failure wasn't the theory, it was me. I was dishonest, manipulative, and cruel. I used Marcus's trust as a lab for my ego. The framework wasn't the weapon I was. So judge me. Tag this story, dissect it, use it as proof that open relationships fail or that some people are irredeemable. Just remember that the person you're reading about, the one who catfished her own boyfriend, who sabotaged his happiness, who weaponized feminism to avoid breaking up like an adult, that person isn't a victim of outdated systems. She's a woman who got exactly what she deserved and lost exactly what she couldn't appreciate. I said monogamy is outdated. Turns out, basic human decency is.